24 coal mines shutting down by 2030. That's not a prediction. That's the reality facing Australia's coal industry right now. The mines that collectively produced 53.8 million tons of coal in 2023 are closing their gates. And the implications? They're massive for workers, communities, and the entire Australian economy. But here's what most people don't understand. This isn't just about climate policy or renewable energy. This is about fundamental shifts in global markets, changing export dynamics, and the future of entire regional communities. So what's really happening here? Let's dig deep into the numbers, the mines, and the dramatic transformation reshaping Australia's coal heartland. Australia sits as the world's second-largest coal exporter, shipping 356.1 million tons globally in 2024 alone. That's 26% of all seaborne coal exports worldwide. The industry has been a cornerstone of the Australian economy for decades, contributing billions to GDP and supporting tens of thousands of jobs across Queensland and New South Wales. But the landscape is shifting dramatically. According to Global Data's comprehensive market analysis, Australia's coal production reached an estimated 550 million tons in 2024, representing 2.8% growth from the previous year. Thermal coal, the type burned in power stations, accounts for more than 60% of this output, with the remainder being metallurgical coal used in steelmaking. Key mines driving this recent growth include Bengalla, Clyde, Ironbark No. 1, Maules Creek, Mullerbin, Olive Downs Complex, and Wilkie Creek. Their combined production surged from 41.1 million tons in 2023 to an impressive 54.7 million tons in 2024. The Ironbark No. 1 and Olive Downs Complex mines commenced operations in late 2023 and April 2024, respectively, while the Wilkie Creek mine resumed production in early 2023 after being on care and maintenance since 2014. This demonstrates that even as closures loom, some operations are ramping up, at least for now. But here's where things get real. Starting in 2027, coal production is set to decline sharply. The planned closure of 24 mines will remove production capacity that collectively produced 53.8 million tons of coal in 2023. These aren't small operations we're talking about. These are significant contributors to regional economies, employing thousands of workers directly and supporting countless more through contractors and service providers. So, which mines are closing? The list includes some heavyweight operations. Clermont Mine is scheduled to close in 2027. Then, in 2028, we see the closure of Yallourn and Springvale. By 2029, operations at Aquila and Oakey Creek will cease. And perhaps most significantly, BHP's Mount Arthur mine in the Hunter Valley, one of the biggest coal mines in the world by estimated reserves, will close in 2030. Mount Arthur alone employs about 2,000 workers directly. Mining began there in 2002, extending operations that dated back to the late 1960s. At its peak, this mine extracted up to 20 million tons of thermal coal annually. BHP announced the closure decision after 2 years of attempting to sell the mine, reflecting the collapsing market for coal assets globally. Buyers? They simply weren't interested at viable price points. The closure reflects BHP's broader strategy to divest itself of thermal coal operations entirely. The company has been transparent about this. They're exiting thermal coal as part of their long-term sustainability commitments. But here's the complexity. BHP only has permits from the New South Wales government to operate Mount Arthur until 2026, so they'll need to seek a short extension to keep to their 2030 closure schedule. The NSW government is expected to grant that extension. They need the extra time to plan the transition for affected communities. Now, let's talk about the broader implications. These 24 mine closures reflect Australia's ongoing shift away from coal as part of environmental policies aimed at reducing reliance on fossil fuels. The Australian government has committed to ambitious climate targets, a 43% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 relative to 2005 levels, and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. But, and this is crucial, there's no fixed timeline for the ultimate phase-out of coal-fired power facilities or the closure of all coal mines in the country. Coal-fired generators are required by law to notify the public of any closure plans 3.5 years in advance, but that's it. The government isn't mandating specific closure dates for mining operations, which means market forces and company decisions are driving these closures more than regulatory requirements. The CSIRO has estimated that an additional 44 coal mines are scheduled to close by 2040, beyond the 24 closing by 2030. This includes super emitters like Aquila in 2029, which should result in ongoing emissions reductions. These closures are already built into Australia's forward emissions estimates, which assume that from 2029, emissions are projected to decline due to reduced demand for Australian thermal coal, increased on-site abatement activities induced by the safeguard mechanism, and the closure of several large gassy underground mines. Here's where the story gets even more interesting: the export market dynamics. Queensland and New South Wales together accounted for 98.8% of the country's coal production in 2022. Queensland's Bowen Basin produces the majority of Australia's metallurgical coal, while both states contribute significantly to thermal coal exports. The main coal export terminals tell the story of this industry's scale. Newcastle loaded 143.4 million tons in 2024. Gladstone shipped 67 million tons. Dalrymple Bay handled 61.2 million tons. Hay Point moved 38.5 million tons, and Abbott Point exported 35.3 million tons. The majority, 61% of coal volumes shipped from Australia in 2024 were loaded on Panamax or post-Panamax vessels, with 36% shipped on Capesize vessels. This is serious tonnage moving through Australian ports daily. But the export destinations, they're shifting dramatically. For decades, Japan was Australia's largest coal customer, but that's changed. In 2024, China became the top destination for Australian coal exports, with 84.8 million tons shipped there, a staggering 51.4% increase year-on-year from the 56 million tons in 2023. Following the lifting of China's informal import ban in early 2023, the trade relationship has rebounded significantly. Mainland China now accounts for 23.8% of Australia's coal exports. Japan remains the second largest destination, receiving 105.3 million tons in 2024, up 2.3% year-on-year, accounting for 29.6% of Australian coal exports. However, Japan's total coal imports have been declining, down 12% in 2023 and a further 6.4% in the first half of 2024. Since China's coal trade resumed in 2023, the Japan market now represents just 30% of Australian coal exports, down from being the dominant market for years. India sits in third place, with 40.3 million tons imported from Australia in 2024, representing 11.3% of total exports. But here's the concerning trend. India reduced coal imports from Australia by 18.5% year-on-year. Why? India is aggressively expanding domestic thermal coal production to reduce reliance on imports. The Ministry of Coal plans to boost local production to meet an expected demand of 1.5 billion tons by the 29-30 financial year. According to the International Energy Agency, India consumed about 1.2 billion tons of coal in the 2023-24 financial year, with domestic coal accounting for about 1 billion tons. The country expects to commission at least 13,900 megawatts of additional coal power capacity by the end of 2024, the highest in 6 years. Yet despite this coal expansion domestically, India is sourcing less from Australia as domestic production ramps up. This creates significant uncertainty for Australian exporters who had redirected volumes to India during the Chinese import ban period. Taiwan is the fourth largest importer of Australian coal, receiving 26.8 million tons in 2024, though volumes fell by 7% year-on-year. Exports to the European Union increased by 2.3% year-on-year to 18.1 million tons, while volumes to Vietnam fell by 14.2% year-on-year to 17.1 million tons. Global Data's forecast indicates an initial period of relative stability between 2024 and 2027, with exports expected to hover around 365 to 370 million tons. However, a decline is anticipated from 2028 to 2030 as global emissions targets and changes in energy policy continue to reshape the landscape for coal. The IEA predicts that by 2027, global coal trade will reverse trends initiated by China and India. In China's case, flat coal demand combined with healthy domestic production is expected to reduce import demand. India's ongoing expansion of domestic thermal coal output is expected to outpace demand growth, further curbing import requirements. Let's talk about the economic pressures facing Australian coal miners right now. Cost inflation is hitting hard. Higher labor costs, fuel expenses, and distribution costs are squeezing margins. Coal royalties and rising expenses related to emissions management are adding further financial challenges. Queensland operators in particular are struggling to rein in costs, which remain above pre-2022 levels. The impact of royalty hikes and margin pressures continues to weigh heavily on the sector. Australian hard coal production increased from 340 million tons in 2010 to 2011 to 420 million tons in 2020 to 2021, representing a compound annual growth rate of 1.9% over that decade. But multiple factors have negatively impacted overall coal production and exports in recent years. China's unofficial import ban on metallurgical coal, the global COVID-19 pandemic, labor shortages, and unfavorable weather due to the La Niña phenomenon brought heavy rainfall and severe storms that disrupted mining operations and transport. The future outlook? Global Data expects a marginal decline of 0.6% in coal production to 525.7 million tons by 2030. This relatively modest overall decline masks the significant disruption happening at the operational level, with 24 major mine closures. Now here's a critical question. What happens to the workers and communities? Mount Arthur Mine alone employs 2,000 workers. Hunter Valley Operations employs around 1,500 people. Yan Coal operations across multiple sites employ more than 3,500 people. These aren't just numbers. These are families, mortgages, school fees, and entire communities built around mining employment. BHP's Mount Arthur closure announcement in 2022 came 15 years ahead of the mine's scheduled end of life. The decision crystallized after 2 years of attempting to sell the mine with no viable buyers emerging. Given the collapsing market for coal assets, the lack of interested buyers wasn't surprising, but the announcement is still profoundly significant. The end is no longer speculative. There's a firm deadline for the thousands of workers employed at the mine and for the surrounding communities. Communities in New South Wales' Hunter Valley are more than aware that time is running out for coal mining. Community workshops held around the region discussed what's needed for a just transition. 3 priorities emerged: a local authority to coordinate transition efforts, funding for retraining and new industries, and early planning to avoid the mistakes of past industrial transitions. The New South Wales government has created a Royalties for Rejuvenation Fund and expert panel with $25 million a year to spend on mining communities. But compare that to the $660 million the Western Australian government has allocated to fund the coal transition of a single town, Collie. The scale mismatch is stark. Research shows the best transitions are those that are equitable, just, and well-planned. The Hunter Valley has experience with transition from when BHP shuttered its Newcastle Steelworks in 1999. While not a perfect case study, it provides lessons for today. Particularly important is a collaborative approach between unions and management, ensuring workers have support for redundancy, retraining, financial planning, and finding new employment. Federal government planning on just transitions for coal communities has been complex, with political debate about prolonging coal mining versus accelerating transition. The new Labor government, elected in May 2022, pledged to support the coal industry while simultaneously committing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, a balancing act that's proving challenging in practice. Since the beginning of 2023, the government has granted approval for the operation of 4 coal mines, Ensham Gregory, Isaac River, and Star Coal, indicating its intent to balance net zero goals with coal industry interests. But there's controversy here. The Australia Institute's Coal Mine Tracker reveals that since May 2022, the Federal Environment Minister has approved 11 new coal mines or expansions with 1,677 million tons of lifetime emissions. There are 29 additional proposals for new or expanded coal mines currently waiting for federal government approval. Critics argue that approving new coal mines goes against climate goals. If all 40 proposed new or expanded coal mines were approved, they would cause 13.9 billion tons of lifetime emissions, equivalent to keeping all of Australia's coal-fired power stations operating for an additional 100 years. The Australia Institute and other environmental groups highlight that these proposed projects have not yet been incorporated into forward emissions estimates and could have a significant impact. The International Energy Agency has stated clearly that no new coal projects or gas projects can be approved if the world is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The UN and the scientific community have consistently echoed this position, yet new coal mines continue to receive approvals in Australia. This paradox sits at the heart of Australia's coal challenge. The country has the third largest coal reserves in the world, accounting for around 13.3% of total global reserves, 150.3 billion tons as of December 2021, according to the U.S. Energy Administration. That's an enormous resource base. Only the United States, with 21.7%, and Russia, with 15.4%, have larger reserves. Australia categorizes its coal into black coal, comprising anthracite, bituminous and subbituminous, and brown lignite coal. The quality and variety of Australian coal deposits have made the country a preferred supplier to international markets for decades, but that preference is being tested by changing global dynamics. The domestic consumption story is equally significant. Coal consumption in Australia saw an estimated 5.1% decline in 2023 to 92.4 million tons. Coal has traditionally been the country's dominant source of fuel for electricity generation, but there's been a noticeable shift toward cleaner and more sustainable energy sources. Global data expects a steady decline in Australia's coal consumption at a compound annual growth rate of -6%, dropping to little over 60 million tons by 2030. This decline can be attributed to several factors: stringent government policies, ambitious emissions reduction targets, opposition from environmental groups and communities, and the retirement of older, less efficient coal-fired power plants. Australia's largest coal-fired power station, the Yallourn facility in New South Wales, is scheduled to close in 2025. The Liddell Power Station, built in 1971, has already shut down. More closures are planned over the next decade. The proportion of electricity generated by coal-fired power stations dropped to a record low of less than 50% in early 2025. That's a historic threshold. The Labour government, elected in 2022, pledged that 82% of the country's electricity will come from renewable sources by 2030, a drastic overhaul requiring massive investment in solar, wind, battery storage, and transmission infrastructure. But here's where it gets interesting. BHP has partnered with Acciona Energía to explore developing a pumped hydro energy storage project at the Mount Arthur coal site after mining ceases in 2030. The conceptual studies show this project could support around 1,000 jobs during the construction phase, contribute to ongoing economic activity in Muswellbrook, and provide power for up to 500,000 homes across New South Wales every day. The technology works by running water between two reservoirs at different elevations, connected by large pipes and turbines connected to generators. During periods of lower demand, water is pumped from the lower to the upper reservoir, storing it for later use. When electricity is needed, water flows back down through the turbines, generating dispatchable power on demand. This is precisely the type of storage solution needed to balance intermittent renewable energy. The community has told BHP they want to see Mount Arthur repurposed when mining ends. This pumped hydro study examines the role the site could play in the region's renewable energy future. It's an example of how former coal mining sites might transition to support the clean energy grid, a form of industrial repurposing that could provide a pathway for other closing mines. Yet the challenge remains immense. Evolution Mining's Mount Rawdon pumped hydro project received $50 million in investment from Queensland's CleanCo, demonstrating government support for such transitions. But scaling this across 24 closing mine sites, that requires coordination, planning, and investment at levels not yet committed. The metallurgical coal story offers some contrast to the thermal coal challenges. Metallurgical coal, used in steelmaking, faces different market dynamics. Global trade in metallurgical coal reached an all-time high of 369 million tons in 2024, supported by strong demand from key steel-producing countries in Asia. Australia, as the world's largest exporter of metallurgical coal, maintained stable export volumes at 153 million tons. However, the forecast for 2025 shows a reversal, with global metallurgical coal trade projected to decline by 7% to 345 million tons. This contraction reflects broader economic uncertainty dampening steel demand and consequently the consumption of metallurgical coal. The decline is primarily driven by weakening demand from China, the world's largest steel producer. Australian metallurgical coal faces additional headwinds from repeated weather-related disruptions and competition from Mongolia, which has more than doubled its exports to reach 56 million tons, all directed to the Chinese market. A new railway between Tavan-Tolgoi in southern Mongolia and the border with China commenced operation in late 2022, supporting rising exports that compete directly with Australian supply. Underground coal mine operations face particular scrutiny due to fugitive emissions, methane released during mining. Fugitive emissions from Australia's coal industry have been a contentious issue, with research suggesting actual emissions may be twice the national estimates. Underground mines can be significant methane emitters, with some operations labeled as super emitters, contributing disproportionately to overall coal sector emissions. Anglo American, which previously owned super-emitting metallurgical mines such as Moranbah North, Grosvenor, Aquila, and Grasstree, invested in excess of $100 million per year in methane capture infrastructure and pre-mine drainage in recent years. These strategic investments aim to reduce emissions while maintaining production levels. If strategic investments are made, fugitive emissions at many super-emitting mines could be decreased by between 70 and 80%. However, fugitive emissions from surface open-cast mines comprise 80% of total emissions and are currently unabated. Australia is working on several methane reduction strategies, but has no national objective, despite the country's commitment to join the global methane pledge. The closure of gassy underground mines will naturally reduce fugitive emissions. The CSIRO's estimates assume that from 2029, emissions are projected to decline due to reduced demand for Australian thermal coal, increased on-site abatement activities induced by the safeguard mechanism, and the closure of several large gassy underground mines. Historical mine closures demonstrate the pattern. Coal Cliff Mine closed in 1992. Underground mining at Musselbrook and Collinsville ceased in 1997. Dartbrook shut down in 2007. Mannering Colliery closed in 2013. West Wallsend Colliery ended operations in 2016 after 47 years of mining. And Austar Coal Mine closed in 2020 after 100 years of mining. Additionally, partial closures occurred at many super-emitting mines due to methane-related incidents and explosions. In 2017, Appin Coal Mine, the highest-emitting coal mine in the country, was partially closed and production significantly reduced for 2 years due to unsafe gas levels. In 2018, North Goonyella Coal Mine closed after a fire following months of rising methane levels. Grosvenor Coal Mine experienced a major methane-related fire in 2020 following 27 recorded methane exceedances in the prior year. The mine reopened only to experience another massive explosion. These safety incidents underscore the risks inherent in underground coal mining, particularly in gassy seams. They also highlight why some mines close earlier than planned. Safety concerns can override economic considerations. Looking at the broader political and economic context, in 2023-24, Australian governments allocated $14.5 billion in spending and tax incentives to support the fossil fuel industry, a 31% increase from 2022-23. Forward estimates indicate subsidies have risen from $57 billion to a record $65 billion, an amount 6.5 times larger than the Housing Australia Future Fund. Critics argue these subsidies contribute to greenwashing and undermine efforts to implement effective climate policies. Advocates for subsidy reform highlight that reducing fossil fuel subsidies could lead to significant emissions reductions while reallocating funds toward public services and sustainable initiatives. The tension between supporting existing coal operations and workers while transitioning to a lower emissions economy creates complex policy challenges. Banks have started restricting support for thermal coal. Westpac introduced limits on lending for new thermal coal mines, including a restriction to projects with coal grades above 6,300 kilocalories per kilogram. By 2021, Australia's Big Four banks committed to leaving thermal coal by 2030, pledging alignment with the Paris Climate Agreement. In 2021, ANZ concluded that the Port of Newcastle could become a stranded asset and divested when the port was refinancing. This financial sector shift reflects global investment trends moving away from thermal coal. The collapsing market for coal assets that prevented BHP from selling Mount Arthur isn't an isolated case. It's indicative of broader changes in how financial markets view coal mining investments. Australian power stations are expected to stop burning coal by 2038 or earlier. The Australian electricity market has been moving away from coal as renewables, especially solar power, are developed. The proportion of electricity generated by coal-fired power stations dropping to less than 50% in early 2025 marks a historic turning point. Yet the paradox remains. While domestic coal use declines and mines close, Australia continues to approve new coal mines for export. The argument from proponents is that if Australia doesn't supply coal to international markets, other countries will. So Australian coal exports don't necessarily increase global emissions, they just shift the supplier. Critics counter that this logic ignores the fundamental need to reduce global coal consumption to meet climate targets. Every new coal mine approved locks in decades of future emissions through the lifetime of the project. The Australia Institute's tracking of proposed coal mines with combined lifetime emissions equivalent to running all Australian coal power stations for 100 additional years illustrates the scale of this commitment. The global context matters enormously. China, Australia's largest coal customer in 2024, has been building coal-fired power plants at an unprecedented rate. In 2023, China reportedly built two-thirds of the world's new operating coal plants. Yet simultaneously, China built two-thirds of the large-scale wind and solar plants under construction, and in the first 5 months of 2024, China built 89% of the world's renewable capacity. According to the IEA's World Energy Investment 2024, China accounted for 95% of global coal-fired power plants that reached final investment decision in 2023. Against the backdrop of rapid expansion of renewable capacity in China, these new unabated fossil fuel power plants face the prospect of very low utilization and reliance on capacity markets. Thermal coal use in China rebounded in 2023 as drought reduced hydropower production, but the long-term trajectory suggests declining import demand as domestic production remains strong. India presents a different dynamic. Coal consumption continues trending upward, with plans to commission significant additional coal power capacity. However, India's Ministry of Coal aims to boost local production to meet expected demand, reducing the role for imports. Australia's coal exports to India declined 11% in 2023, and the country may not benefit significantly from India's coal growth ambitions as domestic production expands. The IEA forecasts that global coal trade will decline by 5% to 1,468 million tons in 2025, reversing previous upward trends. Thermal coal trade is set to decrease by 6% to 1,111 million tons, while metallurgical coal trade is expected to contract by 3% to 357 million tons. Looking ahead to 2030, global thermal coal trade is expected to continue its downward trajectory to a level of 936 million tons. This trend is primarily driven by developments in China and India. Declining coal demand in China combined with strong domestic production and India's expansion of domestic thermal coal output outpacing demand growth. Many Western countries advancing coal phase-out strategies contribute to the broader decline in global thermal coal trade. For Australia, this presents a stark reality check. The country's position as the world's second-largest coal exporter faces pressure from both sides, declining international demand and domestic policy commitments to emissions reduction. The closure of 24 mines by 2030, removing 53.8 million tons of production capacity, reflects this squeeze. Yet the question remains, is this the end of Aussie coal? Not entirely. Even with the mine closures, Australia is projected to maintain production around 525.7 million tons by 2030, still one of the world's largest producers. Metallurgical coal for steelmaking maintains more resilient demand than thermal coal, though facing its own challenges. The transformation is undeniable, though. From the Hunter Valley in New South Wales to the Bowen Basin in Queensland, coal communities face unprecedented change. The mining operations that have defined regional economies for generations are winding down. Towns like Muswellbrook, Singleton, Moranbah, and Mackay must navigate economic transitions that will reshape their futures. Some operations will continue. New mines like Olive Downs and Ironbark No. 1 demonstrate that investment still occurs in selected projects. But the overall trajectory is clear: contraction, consolidation, and ultimate decline. The workers facing these transitions deserve more than abstract policy commitments. They need concrete support, retraining programs, financial assistance, alternative employment pathways, and investment in new industries. The $25 million annual allocation from the NSW Royalties for Rejuvenation Fund pales compared to the scale of challenge ahead. BHP's exploration of pumped hydro at Mount Arthur offers one model for repurposing mine sites. Similar opportunities might exist at other closing operations: renewable energy projects, advanced manufacturing facilities utilizing existing infrastructure and skilled workforces, or entirely new industries. But this requires vision, investment, and coordinated planning across government, industry, and communities. The export terminals at Newcastle, Gladstone, Dalrymple Bay, and Hay Point that moved hundreds of millions of tons of coal in 2024 will see declining volumes in coming years. Port infrastructure built for coal might need repurposing or adaptation. The economic ripple effects extend far beyond the mines themselves. Transport companies, equipment suppliers, maintenance contractors, hospitality businesses, and retail all depend on the coal sector's activity. Australia's climate commitments, 43% emissions reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050, require this coal transition. The closing mines represent progress toward those goals. Domestic electricity generation shifting away from coal toward renewables demonstrates the transition in action. Yet the tension between domestic decarbonization and continued coal exports for international markets creates policy contradictions that haven't been resolved. The global coal market's future trajectory will heavily influence Australia's coal sector. If China and India truly reduce import demand as projected, Australian exports face declining markets regardless of domestic policy decisions. The IEA's forecast of global thermal coal trade declining to 936 million tons by 2030 from current levels means fierce competition for remaining demand among Australia, Indonesia, Russia, Colombia, and South Africa. Indonesian coal exports, which reached 549 million tons in 2024, compete directly with Australian thermal coal, particularly in Asian markets. Indonesia's proximity to customers, lower costs, and expanding production capacity make it a formidable competitor. Russia, despite Western sanctions, continues directing 75% of its coal exports to Asia, adding further competitive pressure. The price environment matters enormously. Australian coal miners facing cost inflation pressures, higher royalties, and emissions management expenses need strong international prices to maintain profitability. Persistently low international coal prices undermine production economics, making marginal operations unviable. This market reality accelerates closures beyond climate policy drivers. The 24 mines closing by 2030 represent both challenge and opportunity. The challenge is managing the human, economic, and social impacts on workers and communities. The opportunity is demonstrating how resource-dependent regions can successfully transition to diversified, sustainable economies. The Hunter Valley's experience transitioning from the Newcastle Steelworks closure in 1999 provides lessons, both positive and cautionary. Collaborative approaches between unions and management, early planning, retraining support, and community investment made differences. But the transition was far from perfect, and some impacts persisted for years. This time, with 24 mines closing rather than single operations, the scale demands proportionally greater response. Federal and state governments must coordinate with industry, unions, and communities to plan comprehensive transitions. The Western Australian government's $660 million allocation for Collies coal transition shows the investment scale required for proper support. International experience offers models. Germany's coal phase-out in the Ruhr region involved massive investment in infrastructure, education, technology hubs, and new industries. While not perfectly analogous to Australian circumstances, the principle holds. Successful transitions require substantial, sustained investment beyond token allocations. The renewable energy transition creates employment opportunities, but they don't automatically replace coal jobs in the same locations with the same skill requirements. Solar farms and wind projects employ far fewer permanent workers than coal mines. Battery manufacturing, green hydrogen production, or advanced manufacturing could provide alternative employment pathways, but require different skills and deliberate industry development. The 2,000 workers at Mount Arthur Mine, the 1,500 at Hunter Valley operations, and thousands more across the 24 closing operations need pathways forward. Some might transfer to remaining coal operations, some might transition to renewable energy roles, some might leave mining entirely, but all need support through the transition. The broader Australian economy must absorb this workforce transition while simultaneously pursuing climate goals. The mining expertise and work ethic these employees possess represents valuable human capital that shouldn't be lost. Harnessing that capability for new industries makes economic and social sense. So, is this the end of Aussie coal? It's the end of coal's dominance in the Australian energy mix. It's the end of unchallenged expansion. It's the end for 24 specific mining operations. But it's not the absolute end. Coal production continues. Exports continue, though both on declining trajectories. The transformation represents one of the most significant industrial transitions in modern Australian history. The outcome depends on choices made now, how governments support affected communities, how industry manages closures, how workers are assisted through change, and how regional economies diversify. The closure of 24 coal mines by 2030 isn't an isolated event. It's part of global shifts in energy systems, climate policy, and economic priorities. Australia's response will demonstrate whether resource-dependent economies can successfully navigate these transitions or whether communities bear unacceptable costs. The coal that built modern Australia, that powered industries, that generated export wealth, that supported regional communities for generations, that coal is running out of runway. Not because reserves are depleted. Australia has 150.3 billion tons of proven reserves, but because the world is changing. Global markets shifting toward renewables, international climate commitments requiring emissions reductions, financial institutions withdrawing support, and domestic electricity generation transitioning away from coal all converge to reshape Australia's coal future. The 24 mines closing by 2030, removing 53.8 million tons of annual production, represent the visible manifestation of these forces. Behind each closure stand workers wondering about their futures, communities planning for changed economies, and an entire industry grappling with its transformation. The opportunity exists to manage this transition well, supporting workers, investing in new industries, repurposing infrastructure, and building sustainable regional economies. The risk exists of managing it poorly, abandoned communities, stranded workers, and social costs that persist for generations. The choice is ours to make. The closures are coming, that's certain. How Australia responds will define whether this transition becomes a success story of adaptation or a cautionary tale of industrial decline. 24 coal mines closing by 2030. It's not the end of Australian coal, but it's absolutely the end of an era. The transformation is underway. The decisions made today will echo through these communities for decades to come. and the world is watching how Australia navigates one of the most consequential industrial transitions of our time.